Joan by Carol M Mottershead. Life without John was difficult for a while. He left a void in all our hearts that was hard to fill, especially for Nicholas. Their friendship had been the only friendship Nicholas, or I for that matter, had ever known. Pulcinella still had Scaramouche, but for us we had a deep sense of loneliness. John had been such a chatterbox, you never had chance to feel lonely whilst he was around. Nicholas seemed to withdraw into himself, his books. We didn't even have our puppet shows to occupy our time, for without John, neither of us felt inclined to attempt a show. Even the children missed him. Even they didn't ask for a show. He was a great loss to us all. I found myself thinking more and more about my family. Mother and father were dead. Governess and John D would be no more, unless they too had taken the potion that now inflicts its side effects on us. Polly? What about Polly? She had been given the potion too. Would she have survived? And now the loss of John. Immortality was a very lonely condition. We had lost so many people in our lives, and their loss never got any easier. The only way to cope was to become insular, never get too close to anyone. We were a family, and we had each other. "You have me, what more could you want?" joked Pulcinella when I was being maudlin. But I'm sure he felt much the same. Pulcinella appeared to many to be just a fool, a lad about town, a bit of a wag, someone who took nothing serious. But really, he was a hard worker who cared a great deal for his family and friends. He made so few, they were as good as family. He was always either performing or on the lookout for new talent, new writers, new contacts, new actors. Scaramouche kept him company most of the time, but Scaramouche could drink the most hardened drinker under the table. And as time went on, they both convinced themselves that everybody they met was a potential good contact, and needed entertaining, or made to feel special by plying them with drinks. In the end they were drinking before, after, and sometimes during work. It didn't stop there either, for the New World privateers were bringing into the country new types of tobacco and new drinks. Pulcinella was changing, since he and Scaramouche had become close friends. His constant presence in our lives felt intrusive at times. Always pleasant, friendly and respectful to me, even helpful at times. It was hard to dislike him, but he had too much influence over Pulcinella. There was just something I didn't quite trust about him. Like spider senses, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I had reservations. "Don't be such a prude, Joan," Pulcinella would say when Scaramouche had yet another woman on his arm. "He's a good man. A bit of a lad, but a good man. Now, come here, wife. Give me a kiss," he'd grin. It was nights like those when he had both been drinking heavily and Scaramouche had a woman on his arm that Pulcinella would make unwelcome advances towards me. Usually I could shrug him off with an excuse of some kind, and he'd just eat his supper and fall asleep. Then one night, "Give me a kiss," he demanded. I refused. I tried telling him to sit down and eat his supper, but he was having none of it. Instead, Pulcinella slapped me. I remember crying out with shock. I'd never in my life been hit before. Pulcinella must have seen the look of horror on my face, as he seemed to snap back into reality. "I'm sorry," he cried, as I ran from the room, holding my cheek. He tried apologising over and over. He tried teasing, "Let me kiss it better," but I didn't want him touching me. Pulcinella had never so much as raised a hand to me before, not even in jest. I had left the room quickly, silently, leaving Pulcinella to sleep it off in front of the fire. Of course I wanted to know what was going on. Why was he behaving that way? But questions would have to wait till morning. For now, I had to put some distance between us. I didn't sleep much that night. As the initial shock wore off, I started wondering what was wrong. So what if I didn't want any kissy-kissy with him when he was drunk? Why should that warrant a slap? I remembered with shame that one time I'd hit him with my frying pan. It was a very long time ago, and I remember the shock I felt afterwards. It had hurt me more than it had hurt him with his thick skull. Momentarily I laughed at the thought. But it was because I hadn't been coping with a new baby. So was there something the matter with Pulcinella? I didn't really care at the moment, but I cried myself to sleep, hoping to wake in the morning to find it was all a bad dream. I was only glad that Nicholas hadn't seen it happen. The next day, Pulcinella was acting all gallant again, helping with chores, cooking breakfast. I felt relief. I had been dreading a confrontation, and I didn't push to talk about it. Least said, soonest mended, I thought. I was beginning to know now what complete loneliness felt like. I'd often felt alone as a child, but not like this. This was complete. The feelings ran deep. My family, Pulcinella and Nicholas, were everything to me. I had no parents to turn to, no friends to speak of, and although Nicholas and I still entertained ourselves with the puppets from time to time, although they'd always helped me to talk through my problems in the past, I couldn't allow Nicholas to find out what had happened. I should have been able to talk to my husband, but with him working so much, and what with this change in his behaviour, we were becoming distant. Being hit for the first time in my life. I couldn't help blaming myself for making him angry, yet at the same time I wondered, what had I done that was so wrong? It was nothing different to any other night when he'd come home drunk. Nicholas noticed I was quieter than usual, and instead of quietly reading together one evening, he asked why. I didn't want to tell him the truth. Instead, I said I was missing John. He seemed to understand. "You shouldn't mourn him, Mother," he said. "He's not dead. He's off on an adventure of a lifetime, like he always wanted. He wouldn't want any of us moping around." Nicholas was right, of course, and since I couldn't tell him the truth, I would have to go along with my story. Nicholas suggested we make the effort to celebrate our memories of John. We'd never known his birth date, but we did know the date he joined our troop. It was a day before William married Anne, so it was agreed we would spend 27th of November remembering John. Together, for none of us begrudged John his new life. He was kind-hearted, with a zest for life that would make most people envious, and we felt honoured to have shared even a small part of his life with us. Celebrations we loved, so after a hearty meal with the whole troop, we began our evening's entertainment with our puppet show. John's puppet danced and sang for us, courtesy of Nicholas, his brother. The puppets told the story of his time with us, and each of us wished our friend farewell, a safe arrival, and a wonderful life. He deserved it. It was some time before the puppets were used again, but one day in spring, Pulcinella came across the wooden chest that contained my puppets. Nicholas had carved a lovely design onto the chest, a ship on a calm sea, transporting his friends safely to the new world. The North Star to guide his way, and 3 lonely figures waving him off as the ship sailed away. A quote from a mutual friend carved beneath it, saying, "It be not the stars that hold our destiny, but ourselves." Our puppet shows became almost as popular as Pulcinella's, something Pulcinella remarked upon sarcastically one evening. "You two seem to be getting very popular," said Pulcinella, after one of his post-performance drinking sessions. "I'll be paying you next," he laughed mockingly. I hadn't told him that we sometimes found money left on the table after the guests had gone, for I had simply set it aside for a rainy day. Nicholas glanced over in my direction, and Pulcinella caught sight of it. "What's that about?" he questioned loudly and drunkenly, accusing us of furtive looks. Nicholas and I looked at one another again, not quite knowing what to say next. I signalled with a nod and an anxious smile that he should leave the room. Pulcinella started demanding answers. "Speak to me, woman," he yelled. I backed away, afraid to see him so angry. I didn't know why I should be feeling scared of my husband after all these years. We'd only had that one real fight where he'd struck me, but then Scaramouche arrived with one of the ladies on his arm, and Pulcinella became all sweetness and light again. His tone completely changed as he greeted his friend. "Drinks all round, Joni," he called. I set to work, glad of the interruption. Scaramouche caught my eye as I left the room and noticed my uneasiness. I poured drinks for our guests, offered some supper, which was declined, and placing the rest of the jug of wine with bread, cheese and a knife on the table, I excused myself for the night, leaving Pulcinella to entertain his guests. I had done nothing wrong, so what was I afraid of? I decided it was best to speak to Pulcinella when he was sober. That night I worried myself silly. I'd not told Pulcinella about the money because, as far as I was concerned, it was just part of the housekeeping money, our money. I'd set it aside for a rainy day, but after the sarcastic way he spoke about my shows, earning money, I felt like he didn't respect me anymore. He was laughing at me and my puppets. But we were earning. I thought he'd be proud of us, of me. "We even put Pretty Polly back into the puppet show," I told him the next morning. "You know how people love a bit of slap and tickle, so we put in the slap. Do you remember that time you grabbed her at the end of the dance, thinking it was me, and tried to kiss her?" I laughed nervously as I told the tale. Pulcinella half smiled at the memory. I told him about young John and his singing and dancing, about Toby the dog tripping up the other puppets, about Scaramouche clowning around like he does in the main plays. Then I poured out the money from the jar onto the table, hoping he'd be pleased. Pulcinella partially smiled. He wasn't overly pleased, but he didn't say anything. He just hugged me and gave me a kiss on the forehead. Like I was a child he had to pacify, and walked away quietly, without finishing his breakfast. That was not like Pulcinella. I was left not knowing what he was thinking. Pulcinella's behaviour was becoming unpredictable. I was worried there was something wrong. Nicholas and I had distractions from our work that helped us cope with the stresses of daily life. But what had Pulcinella? He wouldn't open up to me, and blamed all his bad moods on working too hard. He was staying out more and more, arriving home later and later. We were having more fallings out than fallings in. And one night he arrived home early and caught me crying. I was sat darning a sock in front of the fire, sitting in his chair opposite, a forlorn look on his face. He didn't even ask why. He just stared into the flickering flames of the dying embers. I decided it was time to ask him the burning question that had been bugging me for days. Is there another woman in your life? There was silence for a moment, as if thinking of his answer. Don't be stupid, woman, he answered, still staring into the fire. He sat silent for a moment, then turned to face me. He took the darning gourd and thread out of my hands, and holding one hand to still me, he placed the items on my lap, took both my hands in his, and looked directly into my eyes. I wasn't sure what his reaction was going to be, and sat nervously awaiting his next words. Was it bad news, I wondered? He was leaning into me now, holding both my hands as he used to, and held them to his lips. His eyes were searching my own as if looking for something. The silence was almost too much. There was pain in his eyes I'd not seen before. I wanted him just to say something, but dare not ask any more. Then he spoke the kindest words he'd spoken to me for a long time. Joan, my sweetest darling Joan. There are not the words to express how I feel about you, how I've always felt about you. I've only ever had eyes for you. It's only ever you I wanted to play kissy-kissy with. He tried smiling, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. He kissed my hands in the way he used to, tenderly and lingering. The memory of the first time he kissed my hands sent a tingle down my spine. It had been so long since we'd had any intimacy. I longed to have my husband back. I prayed he'd tell me what was his problem. I couldn't bear to see the pain in his eyes. If I could help, I would. I wanted to help. I wanted my husband. I missed him. The man I once married. Lost in the moment, I kissed Pulsnella on his now bowed head, and blushed, pushing Pulsnella away as Nicholas entered the room. That night we went to bed and made love as we'd never made love before. Passionate, demanding and hungrily seeking out each other's body. We fell asleep together. The first time in a long time. I hoped we'd reached a turning point. Maybe now the elephant in the room, the unspoken question, had been addressed. Pulsnella would open up to me, tell me what it was that was bothering him. I loved Pulsnella with all my heart and soul, and I wanted only to make a better life for us, to be happy. I didn't know how we were going to do it, how I was going to help if I didn't know the problem. Talk to me, Pulsnella, I prayed. Yes, I found myself praying. Praying to who? I didn't know. Nor did I know if there was anyone listening to my plea. I love my family and would do whatever it took to make them happy. I just needed to know what I could do.